Hi folks, thank you so much for joining. This topic has been on my list for a very long time, indeed since last time Israel invaded Gaza 10 years ago, in 2014. As many have been pointing out, this is a very long and relatively complicated history, with most people avoiding going too deep into it because you could be here all day. Amidst so much misinformation, half-truths and very shallow starting points of this story, I decided to hopefully provide an easy and clear way for everyone to get a better overview of the vast history going all the way back to 1200 BC and more. We all know bits and pieces along the way, but this video seeks to tie it all together. For those of you who are new to my channel, welcome. I aim to make history as easy and accessible to as many people as possible, because history is far too important to be just for history nerds like myself. This is probably the biggest video I have ever made in one go in my 10 years of making Manny Does History. I've been working on this script and probably over 700 illustrations for the last 5 months. This is a hugely labour-intensive job, all to provide the world with free educational resources. These videos are not possible without ongoing support from Patreon and or YouTube memberships. And with the way the economy and indeed the YouTube algorithms have gone, it's becoming more and more difficult to produce this high-quality edutainment on here. Chances are, due to the nature of this video I'm about to talk about, this video will probably struggle to be monetized effectively. But it's too important a topic for me to remain silent on due to an algorithm. All of this to say, please consider supporting the creation of these videos through patreon.com/John D Ruddy or by becoming a member here on YouTube. Both include loads of benefits, including custom illustrations and sneak previews into future projects. I really want to continue making these videos, but if it's not sustainable, I might have to give it up. So please support, and thank you indeed to all my current Patreon and YouTube members. Special welcome to my newest supporters: Catherine Ellis, Deanna Boone, Jesse Filman, Roberto, Max Schmidt, Martin Voss, Francisco Martinez, Flora Jane Simpson, Excite Mike 64, Sean Hope, Gary O'Shea, Michael Plessy, Katrina Geard, Majestic Firebird, I love that name, Kevin O'Donnell, Taya Hartman, and Anil. Also, content warning for this video. It indeed covers the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. Nothing too graphic here, but it's not pleasant. On top of that, indeed talk of the current conflict in Gaza and beyond, Islamophobia, persecution. So much is wrapped up in this conflict. Again, there's nothing graphic, but it's not pleasant. This video is as lighthearted as possible and as child-friendly as possible, but my lightheartedness certainly has its limits. So, without further ado, here is the long history of Israel and Palestine. Manny Does History. The Middle East is often known as the cradle of civilization, as it was here, particularly between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, that the first major cities of people began to sprout up. As different peoples moved around, different cultures and beliefs developed. One group of people who began to settle in the region between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, known as Canaan, were the Israelite people. Another group were the Peleset, or Philistines, who lived in Philistia. The 12 Israelite tribes called this place Israel, and later united to form the Kingdom of Israel. And they had many kings, including King David, with the city of Jerusalem as their capital. They built their temple in Jerusalem, and later the kingdom would divide into Israel and Judea, from which they would get their name, the Jews. The Jewish kingdoms suffered several invasions from their neighbours, including the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who burnt Jerusalem and captured many Jews, bringing them back to Babylon. Where many at this time believed in loads of different gods, the Jews believed in one God, whom they called Yahweh. They believed that God had promised Israel to them and that they were his chosen people, and their desire to return to their homeland of Israel, or as they often named it, Zion, became a part of their religion and culture. When the Persians conquered Babylon, they freed the Jews and allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The Greeks would invade, and some Jewish communities began sprouting up across the eastern Mediterranean. The Greeks would later ban Jewish practices, leading to the Jewish Maccabean revolt, which is remembered by Hanukkah, and cemented a cultural identity of Judaism amongst the followers of Yahweh. Ultimately, the region became engulfed by the Roman Empire. The Greeks and Romans called this southern region Palestine, named after the Philistines, where the city of Gaza was built. The Jews believed God would send a great hero to save them from their oppressors, the Messiah. There were some who believed a young carpenter from Nazareth named Jesus Christ was the Messiah, though his leadership from oppression was more on a spiritual level. Nonetheless, his preaching of love and peace gained him many followers, many believing him to be the Son of God. Not long after arriving in Jerusalem, Jesus was arrested by Jewish authorities and executed by the Romans. Many believed Jesus rose from the dead, becoming even more powerful. Those who began to follow him became known as Christians, and they began to spread the teachings of Jesus, becoming a new religion. Many of the Jews who didn't believe in Christ's divinity rebelled against the Romans, resulting in the Roman destruction of the Jewish temple and indeed Jerusalem itself, the Romans replacing it with their own colony, Aelia Capitolina. The Bar Kokhba revolt saw the Jews in Judea utterly defeated by the Romans, who placed punishing laws against them, banishing them from Jerusalem, wiping the name Judea off the map, and renaming it Syria Palestina. In the wake of the backlash, Christians further distanced themselves from the Jewish faith. Jewish culture then became mainly centred around Galilee and more dispersed across the empire. Some Jewish communities began travelling across Europe, settling in different places, but were often looked upon in suspicion with their strange language and traditions, sadly often being persecuted and or driven away. The Roman Empire itself ultimately became Christian, but as Rome's power in the east began to diminish, the Eastern Empire, and indeed Palestine, became controlled by the Byzantines in Constantinople, who began to colonise Palestine with Christians. The Persians conquered the land of Palestine, and for a time, Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, before being kicked out in favour of Christians. Down south in the city of Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad had been developing a new understanding of God, whom they called Allah. Fleeing initial persecution for his beliefs in Mecca, Muhammad settled in what became Medina, and he initially established a multi-religious Islamic state around the city. He had hoped the Jews and Christians in Arabia could embrace these new beliefs, but many Jews believed Islam contradicted their traditions, and fearing them as a challenge to his authenticity as God's prophet, Muhammad exiled the Jews from Medina, so conflict with the Jews and Muslims began. Many Muslims believed Muhammad, while in Jerusalem, had ascended into heaven and talked with the holy prophets, so the city of Jerusalem indeed was an important place for now the Jews, Christians and Muslims. Meanwhile, the Christian Byzantines defeated the Persians and regained Palestine. The Prophet Muhammad had died, but his followers began to conquer Arabia. Not long after, the Arabs conquered Palestine, and as they conquered across the Middle East and North Africa, so went with them the Islamic faith. In Jerusalem, Muslims built the Dome of the Rock on the site of the first and second Jewish temples, to mark where they believed Muhammad ascended into heaven. Palestine would come under control of various caliphates and empires over the next few centuries. Despite all these conquests, most of the Palestinians living there were still descended from the ancient people of Canaan, Jews, Muslims and Christians alike, just under new management. In Europe, Christians were banned from lending money with interest by the church, being seen as sinful. Jews living in Europe were often blocked from owning land, so some Jews got into the business of money lending, trading and insurance to earn their pay. Often, lords and kings looking for access to flexible finance would bring in Jewish communities to lend money. But when the peasants began to rumble about taxes and the king's overspending on wars and luxury, the king would often direct the people's anger at the Jews. Not liking that the Holy Lands were now in control by Muslims and the Byzantine Empire was dwindling in power, the Roman Catholic Pope called on European powers to go on Holy Crusade and take the Holy Lands in the name of Christianity. They were initially successful at capturing Jerusalem and establishing several Crusader states, but were ultimately pushed back and Muslims recaptured Jerusalem. The Muslim leader Salah ad-Din agreed that unarmed Christians could still be allowed into Jerusalem and indeed invited Jews to return to the city. The Crusades created a strong sense of Christian pride and identity across Europe, which added to people's anti-Semitism, often blaming Jewish communities for killing Jesus. Jews were often accused of stealing children, performing satanic blood rituals on them, and so many violent massacres against Jews ensued. In both the Christian and Muslim world, Jews were often forced to wear yellow badges so they couldn't blend in, or in Germany, pointy hats as well. Poland was one of the only places in Europe at that time to grant Jews freedom to worship, trade, and travel. Meanwhile, in Palestine, after back and forth being under Christian or Muslim control, Jerusalem and indeed all of Palestine came back under the control of the Turkic and Egyptian slave armies of the Mamluk Sultanate, ending the Crusades. The Catholic Church had set up the Inquisition to convert Jews and Muslims in Europe through torture and keep Europe Christian. The Jews were ultimately expelled from England, then France, and continuing violence towards these people continued across Germany. They were even blamed for the Black Death as it spread across Europe. Jewish communities indeed weren't hit as badly, given that they often lived in their own isolated ghettos. As the Renaissance came to Europe, many Christian businessmen found loopholes in the Church's laws against money lending, often cutting out the Jewish middleman. The Spanish Inquisition had forced many Jews to convert, but many people continued to distrust them, suspecting they were secretly practicing their old traditions, which some of them were. Throughout the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, Jewish people were expelled from Crimea, Hungary, France again, Austria, Spain and Sicily, Cilicia, Lithuania, Portugal, so many kingdoms amidst countless anti-Semitic massacres across Europe, with many, many Jews ending up in Poland. The Christian Byzantine Empire finally fell to the Turkish Ottoman Empire as they captured Constantinople and more referred to it as Istanbul. The Ottomans would then begin to capture more territory south, including Palestine. As Jewish persecution and book burning continued in Europe, some Jews decided to make a new life in the New World, with the first Jews settling in New Amsterdam, later New York, in 1655. At the same time, many Eastern European Jews were killed as Russia and Sweden invaded Poland. As Europe came into the scientific and philosophical Enlightenment, many Jewish intellectuals had their own enlightenment, leading to the rise of a secular Jewish culture amongst many and a push towards Jewish emancipation in Europe. At the same time, many Eastern European Jews developed the spiritual community-based Hasidic tradition, and anti-Semitism would continue. When France fell into the chaos of the French Revolution, forces led by Napoleon Bonaparte were in the Middle East, Napoleon offered Palestine as a homeland for the Jews, hoping to gain a French foothold in the Middle East. But this didn't really materialise. Yet. Once he became French emperor and conquered half of Europe, Napoleon granted Jews certain freedoms and recognitions, but anti-Semitism remained strong in Europe. Jewish emancipation was achieved in many places across Europe throughout the 19th century, but the political backlash saw violence and pogroms against Jews in places like Germany and Russia. Many Jewish people left, some gravitating towards their long-lost ancestral home of Israel, with a small Jewish neighbourhood being established in Jerusalem once again in 1860. More Jewish settlements began to develop in Palestine towards the end of the 19th century, including Rishon LeZion. As the Suez Canal opened, many Yemeni Jews moved to Palestine also. Despite the centuries of invasions and changes of empires and powers, the majority of the people in Palestine in the 19th century, Muslims, Jews and Christians, were descended from the original Bronze Age settlers of that area. 19th century Europe was a continent of nationalistic global empires, with the British, French, Belgians, etc. planting flags across the world, claiming territories, colonising and violently conquering. The United States of America spent the century expanding across North America, confiscating land from indigenous people, and when those people fought back, US forces would wipe them out, reducing indigenous territory to sparse pockets dotted across the map. Another project they participated in was setting up Liberia, a West African colony designed for America to send formerly enslaved black people back to Africa, despite most of them having been in the Americas for generations. Because of this, the new Americo-Liberians didn't really gel with the indigenous population and saw themselves as culturally superior to the natives, and they gentrified the land, enslaved locals, and built a mini America in West Africa. Foreshadowing. In this era of colonialism, many European Jews believed this could be done in Palestine for the Jews. Viennese writer Nathan Birnbaum coined the term Zionism as the idea of a Jewish nation-state, Zion being a longing name for Jerusalem and even Israel itself. Theodor Herzl published Der Judenstaat, calling for the restoration of a Jewish state. The first Zionist organization was founded in Switzerland in 1897. Other places outside of Palestine were considered, such as Argentina or Uganda for a Jewish state, but Palestine was ultimately chosen. And Zionists began investigating Palestine throughout the 1900s, as some wealthy benefactors and private donations helped begin the purchase of land in Palestine for the project, despite local Arab Palestinians already not liking the idea of a sudden influx of European colonists taking their land. And indeed, not all Jews were convinced that Zionism was the right way to go. More Jews flocked to Palestine, many setting up little agricultural communities known as a kibbutz. One suburb of Jaffa would grow to become Tel Aviv. Zionist militias were set up to keep local Palestinians away, who were threatened by the ever-growing number of these foreign communities springing up. Zionists began to revive the ancient Hebrew language as their everyday spoken language, a language which had been dead in everyday use for 2,000 years, but kept alive in Jewish liturgy. When World War I broke out, it saw these major European empires fight against each other. Possibly over 1 million Jewish soldiers fought in this war, and of course their loyalties were questioned all along the way. The British convinced the Arabs to revolt against the secular Ottoman Empire. As the British captured the region, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, one of the leaders of the British Jewish community, promising Britain's support of a Jewish national home on Arab land, recognising that European Jewish colonists right in the middle of the Middle East would be a strong ally to further destabilise the region. After the war, Muslim Christian associations came together in Palestine in the Arab Congress to promote Arab unity and to oppose the Balfour Declaration. The defeated Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and much of the territory was divided up by Britain and France, actively drawing the borders to keep the Arabs divided. Ronald Storrs, the newly appointed British governor of Palestine, compared the new Jewish colonies in Palestine to England's historical colonisation of Ulster in the 1600s, and how that grew to fruition in an Irish province deeply loyal to Britain. The Yishuv, the ever-growing Jewish community in Palestine, established the Assembly of Representatives and the Jewish National Council to further organise themselves together. Meanwhile, during all of this, over 100,000 Jews were killed in pogroms during the chaos of the Russian Civil War. In Paris, the world powers were convening in Versailles and began establishing some new nations based on historical ethnic groups. Emir Faisal outlined a case for the independence of Arab countries. However, in 1922, the League of Nations decided Britain was indeed in charge of British-mandated Palestine, with a view to establish a Jewish state. It suited many European nations to potentially get rid of their Jews, offloading them to Palestine. Fresh off terrorising the people of Ireland, who had been fighting for their independence, some of the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans, the heavy-duty police force who terrorised and murdered Irish civilians and committed several atrocities, were now sent to do the exact same thing to the Palestinians, who were not happy with the increased influx of European Jewish colonists into the region. Mass protests, violence and riots ensued from the Palestinians throughout the late 1920s and 30s, as it became clear that the British were very much favouring the new Jewish colonists. Jewish settlers organised a paramilitary group called Haganah to fight Palestinians. The entire situation was made worse by the huge rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, particularly in Germany. The Nazi Party blamed the Jews for selling out Germany at the end of World War I, spreading age-old conspiracy theories like secretly controlling the world through banking and media, and indeed, like any other century, when times were tough and the working class were beginning to direct their anger towards the wealthy, the finger was pointed at the Jews, and indeed not just the wealthy ones. The Nazis came to power in 1933, and many Jews fled Germany, some to neighbouring countries, some to the new Jewish nation-state in Palestine, some partially with help from a divisive agreement with Nazi Germany. Germany brought in laws to legally discriminate against Jewish people, loosely based on the tried and tested Jim Crow laws of the southern states of America. The Palestinians led a 6-month general strike, followed by a rebellion throughout the late 1930s, opposing ongoing Jewish colonisation. The UK Peel Commission in 1937 recommended that Palestine should be partitioned, separating the Palestinians from the Jewish state, because the conflict seemed irreconcilable even then. Britain tried to limit Jewish immigration with quotas. This all seemed to be getting out of hand for the British, as Zionists and Palestinians were at each other's throats. All the while, the looming threat of Nazi Germany was growing, as Jews in Germany were attacked and Jewish businesses and synagogues destroyed en masse in the Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. As World War II broke out and Nazi Germany took control of most of mainland Europe, they began gathering Jews from all across the territory, particularly from Eastern Europe, stealing their belongings, putting the Jews in ghettos, and ultimately sending them to concentration camps, work camps, and death camps in what became known as the Holocaust. During the war, Zionists in America met in New York, calling for unlimited Jewish immigration to a new Jewish commonwealth in Palestine. Some who believed in a Jewish Arab state were pushed aside. After shipping all of the Jews off to Madagascar proved too impractical, the Nazi regime hoped to use the fog of war to commit heinous atrocities, and they exterminated 6 million Jewish people, along with several million other minorities, including Romani people, disabled people, and queer people. Sadly, many countries actively helped Germany in their final solution, anti-Semitism being alive and well across Europe, although Denmark managed to save most of their Jewish population by allowing them to escape to neutral Sweden. Big it up, Denmark. Thankfully, Germany lost the war, and many of the concentration camps were liberated, though many's experience beyond the camps was just as bad, being abused by soldiers, and many finding their homes stolen by other locals. The newly formed United Nations would go on to recognise genocide as an international war crime based on the work of Raphael Lemkin. Many European Jews left Europe, many moving to America, many moving to the ever-strengthening Jewish state in Palestine. Some Arab Palestinians took in Jewish refugees amidst the aftermath of the Holocaust. Now, more than ever, do Jewish people feel the need for securing a Jewish state for a Jewish people, independent even from their British overseers. With more and more paramilitary terrorism and Britain in a bad state after the war, Britain suggested it might relinquish control of Palestine. The United Nations now proposed a plan of partition between a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem itself under UN control. None of this was implemented, though, as it sparked a civil war between the Jews and Arabs, as the two-thirds majority Arabs would be getting less than half of the land. In 1948, as Britain planned to withdraw, Zionists declared independence, and the State of Israel was created with its capital in Tel Aviv. Neighbouring Arab states invaded Israel, becoming the Arab-Israeli War. Israeli forces swiftly expanded the territory, forcing 750,000 Palestinians off their land, and crammed into territories around Gaza and the West Bank of the River Jordan. Many fled to neighbouring countries as refugees. Over 500 towns were emptied of Arabs and either destroyed or repopulated by Israelis. This catastrophe is known as the Palestinian Nakba. The UN appointed a mediator in Palestine, but Zionists would soon assassinate him. The UN continued to try and maintain control over the worsening situation for Palestinians, continuing to call for Jerusalem to be under international regime and Palestinians to have the right to return to their homes. Israel negotiated an armistice with its neighbouring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. Jordan would assume control of the West Bank, Egypt would control the Gaza Strip, while Israel proclaimed its capital to be Jerusalem, against UN resolutions. Over the following years, many Arab Jews from across the Arab world were convinced by Israel to migrate and detach from their Arab heritage. Israel established the Jewish law of return for any Jews across the world, automatically gaining Israeli citizenship if they want it, whether or not they've ever set foot anywhere near Israel. Palestinians living in exile did not share that luxury, with many of their descendants never even being allowed to visit their homeland. The UN established UNRWA to help with the Palestinian refugee crisis. Egypt had been blocking Israeli ships from the Suez Canal and the Straits of Tiran, resulting in Israel invading the Sinai Peninsula, with France and Britain getting involved too. Amidst this new Cold War era, the two new superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, told both sides to stand down. Many Palestinian diaspora formed the Fatah movement, aiming for Palestinian liberation. In 1964, the Arab League Summit met in Cairo and called for Arab unity, and from this, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was formed in Jerusalem, while Israel's treatment of Palestinians was becoming more and more brutal. The PLO's initial goal was to destroy Israel and establish a secular Palestinian state in the territory. After years of Egypt blocking Israel's access to the Suez Canal, 1967 saw Israel at war with Egypt, Jordan, Syria and Iraq. The Six-Day War saw massive gains for Israel as it took control of Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan and the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. This greatly bolstered Israeli nationalism, having fought off their enemies and conquered new territory. The US greatly got behind Israel during this war as it allowed them to destabilise the growing power of a secular Egypt in the Middle East. They thought that more radical Islamism was easier to control. Around this time too, Israel was rumoured to have developed nuclear weapons, though it has never been 100% confirmed. The UN called for Israel to withdraw from these newly occupied territories and stop terrorising Palestinians and other Arabs in those regions, and Israel were like, nah. The PLO, now stationed in Jordan, butted heads with the Jordan authorities, resulting in the internal civil war known as Black September. The PLO were driven up to Lebanon, and from this a terrorist group called Black September would emerge, and they assassinated many enemies, most infamously 11 Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympics. In 1973, Egypt and Syria led a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. The war was yet another proxy war of the Cold War, with the United States and Soviet Union backing the combatants. Israel fought back, almost reaching Cairo, when the US and Soviets pulled the plug and demanded a ceasefire. In 1974, the PLO gained much international recognition as the sole legitimate representation of the Palestinian people, indeed becoming an observer in the UN. The right of Palestinians to independence and to human rights was recognised, and Israel proceeded to confiscate more land and clearing more Arab cities within Israel. Huge mass protests against this ensued, which is commemorated in Palestinian Land Day. In 1979, Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accords, looking to create peace. The old city area of Jerusalem was put under UNESCO care. With the emergence of more radical Islamic nationalism, the extremist group Palestinian Islamic Jihad emerged, using terrorism to try establish an Islamic state of Palestine. Amidst the ongoing civil war in Lebanon, Israel invaded in 1982 to try and wipe out the PLO and backed Lebanese Christian extremists to massacre Palestinian refugees. The PLO fled to Tunisia. Due to the Camp David Accords, Israel would later return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. In 1987, as Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank neared 20 years, many young Palestinians who had only known Israeli occupation their whole life rose up in protest and frustration in what is known as the First Intifada, a predominantly non-violent uprising. Out of this, however, some hardline Palestinians formed the Islamic resistance movement Hamas, advocating the destruction of Israel. Amidst the Intifada, the PLO declared the State of Palestine's independence, while still in exile in Algeria in 1988. Despite the declaration, Gaza, the West Bank, and indeed Syria's Golan Heights continued to be occupied by the Israeli Defense Forces. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a huge influx of Jews from those territories who had had limited travelling ability during the Soviet era. More peace talks would ensue in the early 90s, ultimately leading to the Oslo Accords, which were signed by Israel and Palestine, aiming for a two-state solution, with the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, recognising Israel's existence and only seeking to solidify the Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, and allowing Palestinians more autonomy within that territory. The Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli ultranationalist who was opposed to these moves for peace. Despite the Oslo Accords, Israel continued to limit Palestinians' freedoms, having laws that favoured Jews over non-Jews, particularly discriminating against Arabs. More and more people drew comparisons to the recently ended apartheid regime of South Africa, separating white people and black people. Israel and Palestine then agreed that most Israeli forces be withdrawn from Hebron in the West Bank in more moves towards peace. But not a lot was actually done. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would later lose his election due to corruption allegations. More and more Palestinian territory would come under control of Palestinian authorities. At the turn of the 21st century, Israel and Palestine came together again at the Camp David II summit, but with no agreements, as Arafat wanted a Palestinian right of return for the millions of Palestinians in exile across the world. Israel had been claiming East Jerusalem and indeed the Temple Mount since 1980. And when soon-to-be Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon visited Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount in September, it triggered the Second Palestinian Intifada, with a massive wave of protests and many terrorist attacks against Israeli occupation. In response to this, Israel reoccupied Palestinian cities in the West Bank. While the UN came up with more and more resolutions, Israeli settlers would continue to move into the West Bank, intimidating Palestinians off their own land, destroying infrastructure, killing olive trees, and brutally reacting to any resistance. Palestinian militant groups such as Islamic Jihad and Hamas launched thousands of rockets into Israel over the years, terrorising the people. The UN, US, EU and Russia formed the Quartet to try and resolve the issues and create a roadmap for peace. But the settlers kept settling. PLO leader Yasser Arafat died in 2004, which left many Palestinians without strong leadership. Israel began to disengage from Gaza in 2005, and Israeli settlers within Gaza were removed. The next year, Hamas won the legislative election in Gaza and began to take control, fighting against Fatah, the more secular Palestinian party, and took control of Gaza. Fatah would maintain control of the West Bank. At the same time, Israel now went to war with the Lebanese jihadist group Hezbollah to the north. But with Hamas's violent presence in Gaza, Israel blockaded Gaza and its nearly 2 million citizens. Over the years, they would tighten their hold on Gaza, sealing it off from the rest of the world, ultimately launching a full 22-day military assault on Gaza. Amidst the war and threat of retaliatory rockets launched from Hamas, the right-wing former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power in Israel. The UN called for a ceasefire and investigated Gaza. Also, to give you an idea of scale, this is the Gaza Strip compared to New York City. Hamas were a very convenient threat to the right-wing Israeli government, seeming less reasonable and much more easy to vilify and justify the Israeli chokehold over Palestinians in the open-air prison of Gaza, keeping Gazans and Palestinians in the West Bank divided. In 2011, Israel obtained the Iron Dome rocket defense system to intercept Hamas rocket attacks. Israel would attack Gaza again in 2012 due to the rockets. Later that month, Palestine was granted non-member observer state status in UN. And in 2014, Israel launched the biggest assault on Gaza since 1967 in Operation Protective Edge, fighting for a month and a half before coming to a ceasefire. Netanyahu continued to win elections. The UN deemed that Israeli settlements in the West Bank violated international law and did nothing about it. More and more support for Israel would come from Christian conservatives in America, who believed that bringing about the prophecies of the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation involved all the Jews returning to Israel. It's deeply cynical. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, aka AIPAC, worked hard in America to ensure ongoing political support from the US. In 2017, US President Donald Trump announced America's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, not Tel Aviv, further bolstering Netanyahu's resolve that Israel's biggest supporter and funder, USA, had their back. The PLO withdrew their recognition of Israel, demanding they adhere to pre-1967 borders, which Israel showed no signs of doing, as more settlers built in the West Bank and Gaza remained surrounded. Trump would then mediate the Abraham Accords, bringing in other Arab states to create a peace plan and push business forward, leaving Palestine behind, still under siege. Under decades of pressure, occupation, persecution and violence, Hamas launched a massive, heinous attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, kidnapping roughly 240 hostages, killing over 1,200 Israelis in bordering areas, and took the world by surprise. It was the largest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust, and many dubbed it as Israel's 9/11. Israel's response was a relentless bombing of Gaza and a ground assault. In 1 month alone, when this script was first written, over 10,000 Palestinians were killed. As of time of publishing, April 2024, the Palestinian death toll is over 30,000. Many Israelis claimed that the people of Gaza deserved it, having voted for Hamas all those years ago. But most of Gaza's very young population weren't able to vote, or probably weren't even alive yet in 2006. Israel's incessant missiles certainly made it clear that they seemed more interested in making Gaza unlivable for its people, because those missiles didn't seem too effective at rescuing hostages. The conflict saw social media take over all sorts of narratives, with propaganda and falsities being shared constantly. I'm making this video now in an attempt to possibly help people begin to understand the long history of this situation and all of the nuance that comes with it. There's a lot not mentioned in this video, and you can let me know which bits in the comments, but this is meant to be a start in understanding this whole conflict. If you want to know more, there's plenty out there to find out. I am not, nor should I be, the last word in any of this. It is a sad irony that a state established by so many Holocaust survivors would go on to treat the Palestinians in such a way, to participate in ethnic cleansing, in genocide, and doing so in the name of self-defense and more living space. Zionists too often accuse any legitimate criticism of the Israeli state as anti-Semitism, using it as a shield. And don't get me wrong, anti-Semitism is alive and well in the world, but not all criticism of Israel is such. In fact, most anti-Semites tend to support Zionism because, again, it gives the Jews somewhere to go, not on their doorstep. It also plays deeply into the concept of ethno-states, which many in the far right are obsessed with. Israel's very public, heinous atrocities towards the people of Gaza, bombing, starvation, destroying hospitals, killing aid workers and journalists, herding most of the population towards the Egyptian border, it all only turns more and more people against Jewish people. And when Israel claims to do this in the name of all Jewish people, it actually fuels anti-Semitism, particularly amongst those who don't understand all of these nuances. One could even argue that that's what Zionists want, as they can continue to play the victim and draw more and more Jews from across an ever-increasingly hostile anti-Semitic world. South Africa accused Israel of war crimes in the International Court of Human Justice in The Hague, and Israel continued doing what it's doing. The USA has continually vetoed UN motions towards a ceasefire, helping Israel to continue pummeling Gaza and its people into the ground. They eventually abstained and allowed a vote through, but well done, lads. By claiming that a handful of UNRWA workers were possibly involved in the October 7th attacks, Israel successfully convinced many countries to defund UNRWA and damage aid supplies to starving civilians. Israeli protesters continue to block aid trucks. The people of Gaza are starving. Many Jewish people don't support Israel's actions. Some Israelis don't support their own government's actions. However, the Israeli government has spent a long time radicalizing their population, particularly younger generations in Israel. If you are one of those younger generations watching this, please just watch it with an open mind. Plenty of people are waiting for the dust to settle so they can build their luxury apartments and resorts on that prime shorefront real estate of Gaza, or whatever it's going to be renamed to try and erase that story too. And if we're going to get really technical on it here, Gaza wasn't even part of the original Kingdom of Israel. Not that matters. The current situation, with most of the Western world's leaders blindly backing Israel, is a backing of continued colonialism. Many Israeli Jewish people play the indigenous card, claiming that they are the people who have been living or should have been living there all along. But the vast majority of them have much stronger, more recent roots in Europe and America. They've won and hosted the Eurovision several times over the decades. Going back to the roots of Zionism in the 1890s, it was a project of European Jewish people to establish a Jewish colony in the Holy Lands, backed by Western powers, because it was a European colony in the Middle East, albeit of the Jewish variety. There are indeed Jewish Israelis who have come from North Africa, the Middle East, and other places, but even they have been historically discriminated against by European Jews in Israel, carrying all the traits of a white supremacist colonialism. Countries such as the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are indeed products of this very similar settler colonialism, although their violent conquests and subjugations were mostly not live-streamed. Most powers in Europe seem hesitant to denounce Israel's actions, partially out of a long sense of guilt for the centuries of European anti-Semitism, which has resulted in the atrocities of today. The people of Gaza, and indeed Palestine, are paying for Europe's guilty conscience. And with all of this being said, don't let this feed into another wave of anti-Semitism either. We continue to fall for the same tricks and lies time and time again. Dehumanization, tribalism, us and them. We're all just people trying to live our lives. Why does it have to be us and them when we are so much stronger together? And I know that sounds cheesy, but it's true. And who doesn't love cheese? Having seen the effects of violence and divisions caused by colonialism in my own country, and seeing the peace process in Northern Ireland, peace and reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants working together, a brighter future is possible, but it requires ongoing work. And all that being said, what is happening in Gaza right now is beyond any scale of what happened during the Troubles. Over several decades, the Troubles in Northern Ireland claimed the lives of about 3,500 people. And that number was hit about 2 weeks into this current phase of the massacre in Gaza. I don't know the solution to this. Two-state solution, one-state solution, whatever. The killing needs to stop. The genocide needs to stop. Ceasefire now. Free all the hostages and free Palestine. My friend Fadl Mustafa, who is indeed a Palestinian living here in Ireland in exile, explained to me the Arabic word kahar, which is an intergenerational, slow-burning anger at the years and years of injustice, racism, dehumanization, and oppression suffered upon a people. It describes perfectly the anger which is simmering in the hearts of many at the injustice towards the now starving people of Palestine. There's all far too much to cover. There are plenty of people out there covering the ongoing events better than me. I'm a history channel, not a current affairs channel. But between IDF killing civilians, or as many have now dubbed the IOF, as opposed to Israeli Defense Forces, Israeli Offense Forces, between canal projects, gas fields, murdered journalists, destroyed hospitals and universities, self-immolation protests, the Flower Massacre, there's all far too much to talk about. And indeed, the current events are still unfolding. But I hope this video has given more nuance and context to the entire situation. And when people get frustrated that the history is too complicated to explain quickly, I hope this video can help. Fair enough, it's like about 40 minutes at this stage, but still. I'm going to finish with the powerful words of Rifat al-Hariri, the Palestinian writer and professor who was killed in an Israeli airstrike at the end of 2023. If I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. Thanks for watching, folks. I'm going to keep this brief. You've seen the monumental work that goes into these videos. This video has taken 5 months to produce, so please support my work either through patreon.com/John D Ruddy or YouTube memberships. It is vital for the survival of this channel. And indeed, like, share and subscribe and click the bell icon for more history videos. If you're new to this channel, I have plenty of history videos for you to catch up on. And I'm a lot more lighthearted than this, but you know, this is just so much. You can go check them out. If you would like to donate to Palestine, I have links to UNRWA down below. There are people, children, starving to death in Gaza right now. So please support UNRWA. You can follow all my socials. You can follow all my socials at John D Ruddy. Thank you. Free Palestine.